The moment the stagecoach pulled away from the Dry Creek station in a cloud of red Oklahoma dust, Charlotte Callahan realized she had made a terrible mistake by not asking the driver the name of the man who had given her his seat. It was the autumn of 1878, and the Oklahoma Territory was not a place that offered many second chances. The land stretched out in every direction like a painting that had never quite been finished, all burnt sienna and sage green, and the occasional silver flash of a creek catching the afternoon sun. Charlotte had been standing at the Dry Creek station for 3 hours with her single leather traveling case and a hatbox that had seen better days, waiting for a seat on the southbound Butterfield line, when the stage had arrived already crowded past any reasonable comfort. The driver, a squat man named Pete Greer with a nose that looked as though it had been broken and poorly repaired at least twice, had announced with no small amount of apology that there was simply no room, and that she would have to wait for the next coach, which would come through in 2 days' time. Charlotte had swallowed the news with the quiet dignity that 4 years of widowhood had given her. She was 28 years old, brown-haired and green-eyed, with the kind of face that looked beautiful precisely because it was honest rather than arranged, and she had been standing there, resigned to 2 more days of waiting in a station that smelled of horse sweat and tobacco, when a voice beside her had said simply, "Take my seat, ma'am." She had turned to find a tall man unfolding himself from the stage door. He was somewhere in his early 30s, she guessed, broad across the shoulders and lean everywhere else, dressed in the working clothes of a cattleman rather than a gentleman, but carrying himself in a way that was neither rough nor apologetic. His hat was pushed back on his head, and he had dark hair and dark eyes that held a kind of settled quiet she found immediately disarming. "I cannot take your seat," she had said, because her mother had raised her with manners even if circumstances had not always honored them. "I've got a horse tied around the back," he had replied. "I was only taking the stage because it looked like rain, but the skies cleared up fine now. Please, ma'am. It would genuinely trouble me to ride comfortable while you wait 2 more days." She had looked at him for a long moment, trying to find the angle in it the way a woman alone in the West learned to look for angles in most things, but there had been none. He had simply meant it, so she had accepted, offered him her sincerest thanks, and climbed aboard while Pete Greer urged the horses forward. She had not thought to ask his name until the station was already a 1/4 mile behind them. The woman seated across from her, a minister's wife named Edna Hallbrook who was traveling to Guthrie to join her husband, had watched Charlotte twist around to look out the rear window and said, "Are you all right, dear?" "There was a man," Charlotte said, and felt foolish for the way it sounded. "He gave me his seat and I did not even ask his name." Edna Hallbrook had smiled the way women of her age and temperament smiled at younger women, as if they could see something the younger woman could not yet see herself. "That sort of thing has a way of working itself out," she said comfortably. Charlotte had turned back around and told herself that was very unlikely. This was the Oklahoma Territory in 1878, and it was vast and indifferent, and people passed through it like water through sand, leaving nothing behind. She would never see the man again. She would arrive in Guthrie, find the teaching position she had applied for, build herself a new life, and that would be entirely that. She was still telling herself this when the stage pulled into the next way station at sundown, and Pete Greer came around to help the passengers down, and she asked him, without entirely meaning to and almost against her own will, whether he knew the name of the man who had given up his seat at Dry Creek. Pete Greer scratched the back of his neck and thought about it. "He did leave something with me, now that you mention it," he said. He dug into the breast pocket of his coat and produced a folded piece of paper, slightly worn at the edges, as though it had been placed there deliberately and had been waiting. "Said if a certain woman happened to ask, I was to give her this." Charlotte stared at the paper. "He said that?" "Yes, ma'am, those were near about his exact words. If a certain woman asks Pete, you give her that. The driver handed it over with no further ceremony and went to see about the horses. Charlotte stepped away from the small crowd of passengers and unfolded the paper by the light of the station lantern. The handwriting was careful but not trained, the penmanship of a man who had learned to write practically rather than elegantly. It said, Owen Holloway. Holloway Ranch, 7 miles south of Calico Creek near the Fork Road Junction. If you are ever in want of anything at all. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the small interior pocket of her traveling coat, right next to the letter from the Guthrie School Board, and did not take it out again for 11 months. Those 11 months were not uneventful. Charlotte arrived in Guthrie and found the teaching position exactly as the letters had promised, a small schoolhouse on the eastern edge of town that served the children of settlers, merchants, and the occasional cattle worker. She threw herself into the work with the concentration of a woman who is very deliberately not thinking about other things. She was good at it. She had always been good with children, patient and warm in equal measure, able to explain the same thing 17 different ways until the right version landed. The children of Guthrie largely adored her within the first 2 weeks. The town itself was a young one, still finding its shape in 1878, with the particular restless energy of a place that has decided it will become something, and has not yet determined exactly what. There were good people in it and the other kind, and Charlotte learned to tell the difference with reasonable speed. She made friends with a woman named Agnes Prout, who ran the dry goods store with her husband Franklin, and who had opinions about nearly everything and was right about most of them. She made a cautious acquaintance with the local marshal, a man named Roy Deakins who was honest in the mechanical way of a man who has never been genuinely tested, and she kept her own company in the evenings in the 2 rooms she rented above the saddlery, reading by lamplight and listening to the town settle into its nightly sounds. It was a good life. It was a sensible life. It was the life she had built herself out of the pieces that remained after her husband Thomas had died of a fever 3 weeks after their 2nd anniversary, leaving her with a grief so complete it had taken 2 full years to locate the edges of it and understand that she had survived it. She thought about Owen Holloway perhaps more than was strictly reasonable. She thought about the easy way he had stood up from that stage seat, as though giving something away cost him nothing. She thought about the quiet in his eyes. She thought about the paper in her coat pocket, which she had moved at some point to the small wooden box on her nightstand where she kept her most important things: Thomas's ring, her mother's last letter, the school board contract. She did not write to him. She was 28 years old and a widow and a schoolteacher, and she had good sense. She did not write. But in late September of 1879, a full year after the Stagecoach and the red Oklahoma dust and Pete Greer's crooked nose, Agnes Prout said something at the counter of the dry goods store that changed things. Charlotte had come in for lamp oil and a packet of good writing paper, and Agnes had said, as though it were entirely ordinary conversation, "You know, my cousin Delia came through last week from down near Calico Creek, and she mentioned the Holloway Ranch. Said Owen Holloway's hired man quit last spring, and he's been running the whole operation by himself since. 300 head and no help. Said he's managing, but just barely." Charlotte went very still in the way of a woman who does not want to announce that a thing has struck her. "I don't believe I know any Holloways," she said, which was technically true and entirely dishonest in spirit. Agnes Prout looked at her with the steady gaze of a woman who has been running a store long enough to recognize when a customer is pretending to examine a bolt of calico more carefully than it warrants. "Delia says he's a good man," Agnes added simply. "One of those men who works hard and doesn't complain about it. Not married. Not ever been, she thinks." "That's very interesting," said Charlotte, and paid for her lamp oil and her writing paper and went home. That evening she sat at the small table in her rented rooms with the writing paper in front of her and the lamp lit and her pen in her hand, and she looked at the blank page for a long time. She was not a foolish woman. She understood that a man who had done a kind thing for a stranger 11 months ago had not necessarily been thinking of her every day since. She understood that the note with his name and address might have been a simple gentlemanly gesture and nothing more. She understood that writing to him could embarrass them both, and that it would require a specific quality of courage that she was not entirely certain she possessed. She wrote anyway. She kept it simple and honest, because those were the only ways she knew how to write. She told him that she was Charlotte Callahan, that she had been the woman at Dry Creek Station, that she had kept his note all this while and had been uncertain what to do with it, and that she was writing now simply to say thank you properly, since she had not had the chance before. She said that she was teaching school in Guthrie and that she found the work meaningful. She said she hoped the ranch and the cattle were doing well. She signed it sincerely and sealed it before she could think better of it, and put it in the Guthrie Post the following morning with her heart beating somewhat faster than the occasion might strictly have called for. Then she waited. She had told herself she was not expecting a reply. She was very clear with herself about this. She had written simply to close a chapter, to express a gratitude that had been sitting unresolved in her chest for nearly a year, and she did not expect a response and was entirely prepared not to receive one. Owen Holloway's reply arrived 14 days later. She recognized his handwriting immediately, practical and direct, the same careful letters from the paper Pete Greer had handed her. He wrote that he was very glad she had written. He wrote that he had wondered in the intervening months whether anyone would ask Pete about that note, and he was honest enough to say that by anyone, he had mostly meant her specifically, since he had thought about her rather more than 11 months' time with no conversation warranted. He wrote that the ranch was indeed a great deal of work and that he had been managing it, though managing was the right word for it, nothing more elegant. He asked about the school, what grades she taught, whether the children were the kind that kept a teacher sharp or the kind that tried to wear a teacher down. He said he would be glad to hear from her again if she was inclined, and he did not make it a demand or a flutter, just a plain, honest statement of preference, which she found she liked enormously. She wrote back that same evening. What followed over the next 3 months was a correspondence that began as careful and became something considerably less careful rather faster than either of them had anticipated. They were both adults who had lived enough of their lives to understand the difference between what was real and what was performance, and so the letters were real. Owen wrote about the ranch with the matter-of-fact love of a man who has built something with his own hands and is quietly proud of it, describing the land and the cattle and the particular quality of the light in the Calico Creek country as the seasons changed. He wrote about his father, who had started the ranch and died 5 years back, and about a younger brother named Cal who had gone east for reasons that apparently still confused Owen slightly. He wrote with a dry humor that caught Charlotte off guard the first time it appeared and made her laugh alone in her rented rooms, genuinely and without reserve. Charlotte wrote about the school and the children with the same kind of love, describing small moments that she suspected most people would not find interesting, but that Owen wrote back to say he had found very interesting indeed. She wrote about Agnes Prout, whom Owen came to know through her letters as thoroughly as a person could know someone they had never met. She wrote, very carefully and only after considerable thought, about Thomas, and what the losing of him had been, not as a sorrowful declaration but as simple honesty, because she wanted Owen to understand the landscape of her, and she had found you could not do that while omitting the largest features of it. Owen wrote back about Thomas with a gravity and a gentleness that she had not expected. He did not minimize the grief or rush past it, or make it awkward in the way that men sometimes did with matters of the heart. He simply acknowledged it with full weight and said he was sorry for it, and then said that the fact she had rebuilt herself and her life afterward seemed to him to be one of the more remarkable things about her. By December of 1879, Charlotte was fairly certain she was falling in love with a man she had spent approximately 4 minutes in the physical company of, and the absurdity of this did not diminish the truth of it 1 degree. It was Owen who wrote, in a letter that arrived on a Thursday morning just before Christmas, that he had business to attend to in Guthrie in the new year and wondered if she might be willing to meet him for supper, if she thought it was appropriate. And if not, then he entirely understood and would not press the matter. She was on her way to post her reply before she had finished reading the letter. He arrived in Guthrie on the 5th of January, 1880, on a cold, bright afternoon when the sky was the color of a blue jay, and the main street had a thin coat of frost on it that made everything look briefly beautiful. Charlotte had told herself she would be composed. She was not composed. She was standing on the front steps of Agnes Prout's dry goods store, where Agnes had very sensibly invited her to wait so that she would have company and something to do with her hands, and when she saw Owen Holloway ride in from the South Road on a big roan horse, she felt something happen in her chest that was entirely outside of her control. He had the same quiet about him that she had remembered. A year and some months in memory had perhaps made him somewhat more than life-size in her imagination, which was the risk with long correspondence. But seeing him now, she found that the memory had not exaggerated anything important. He was exactly as tall as she had thought, with the same dark eyes and the same way of carrying himself, unhurried and direct. And when he spotted her on the steps, his whole face changed in a way that was not subtle, a warmth that came up through him and was entirely legible, and she felt her own face doing something similar and did not try to stop it. He tied the roan at the hitching post and came toward her and took off his hat, and they looked at each other for a moment in the January cold with a full year and 3 months of letters between them, and the strange charged intimacy of people who know each other's hearts quite well, and each other's faces hardly at all. "Miss Callahan," he said, and his voice was exactly as she had somehow expected, low and steady and warm in the way that voices are warm when they mean what they're saying. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "you are taller than I remembered." "You are exactly as I remembered," he said, and it was not a flattery, it was just a fact delivered plainly, and she believed it completely. Agnes Prout appeared in the doorway behind Charlotte with the strategic timing of a woman who has been watching out the window. "You must be the rancher from the letters," she said. "I am Agnes Prout. I have heard a great deal about you and have formed several opinions. Come inside and have some coffee before you both freeze to death on my steps." They had supper that evening at the Guthrie Hotel dining room, which was the best establishment the town offered, and they talked for 4 hours without running dry. It was the particular pleasure of people who have already established the deep channels of each other's character through writing, and can now populate those channels with the living texture of voice and expression and gesture. Owen used his hands when he talked about the ranch, not dramatically but economically, tracing the layout of the land on the tablecloth with one finger. Charlotte found herself watching his hands more than she intended to. He listened to her the way that felt increasingly rare to her, with his full attention rather than the partial attention men so often gave to women in conversation, already composing their next point while you were still making yours. He told her about the ranch in the kind of detail that letters don't fully carry, the smell of it in the morning, the particular sound the cattle made when they were settled and content, the way the Fork Road Junction looked in the blue hour before sunrise when the frost was on the grass, and the whole country seemed to be holding its breath. He talked about it the way she talked about her students, with the quiet certainty of a man who has found the thing he was made for and is simply doing it. "Do you ever get lonely?" she asked, because they had been honest with each other in letters and she saw no reason to stop now. He was quiet for a moment, not the silence of avoidance but the silence of a man considering a real answer. "Yes," he said finally. "The ranch is good. The work is good. But there's a size to the quiet out there that can press down on a person some evenings." He looked at her across the table. "Does that sound like complaining?" "It sounds like honesty," she said. He smiled then, and it was the kind of smile that rearranged things. "Do you?" he asked. "Every evening after 8 o'clock," she said honestly. "The school fills up the day thoroughly, and I am grateful for it, but the evenings are long." They walked back from the hotel through the cold January night, and he walked on the street side the way her father had always walked, an old courtesy she had not thought about in years. And at the door of the saddlery building where her rooms were, they stopped, and there was a moment between them that was perfectly balanced, full of everything they had written to each other and the new weight of the real evening. And Owen Holloway did not kiss her, which she simultaneously respected and found maddening. But he held her hand for a moment and looked at her in a way that said everything the moment wasn't ready for yet. "Would you come to see the ranch?" he asked. "Not now. But when the weather turns, I would like you to see it." "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." He was in Guthrie for 4 days. He had a legitimate reason to be there. Some business with a cattle broker named Simmons about spring contracts for the following season, and he attended to that business with his customary efficiency. But the evenings were Charlotte's, and they spent them talking, walking the quieter streets, drinking coffee in the Prout parlor while Agnes made pointed excuses to be elsewhere, and then clearly listened from the other room. On his last morning, Charlotte walked with him to the livery where the roan was stabled, and there was something different in the quality of the farewell, a seriousness, a weight. "I don't want to say things that are premature," Owen said, holding the reins of the horse, looking at her directly in the way she had come to understand was simply how he was. He was not a man who looked away from the things he was saying. "But I want you to know that these 4 days have confirmed everything I thought for the last year and a half." "And what is that?" she asked, though she knew. She wanted to hear him say it. "That you are the most important person I have not spent enough time with," he said simply, "and I intend to correct that if you'll let me." "I'll let you," she said. He rode south toward Calico Creek, and she stood in the livery yard and watched him go until the cold in the distance made the roan and his rider one small dark shape against the frost-white country. And then she went back to her schoolhouse and taught her students the names of the states and the method of long division, and did not think about Owen Holloway at all for perhaps 20 consecutive minutes, which was the best she could manage. They wrote all through the winter and into the spring of 1880. The letters became longer and less guarded, which was not recklessness but its opposite, the careful dismantling of unnecessary protection. Owen wrote about the things he wanted, not in the way of a man making demands, but in the way of a man learning to speak his own interior life out loud, which she understood was new for him, and which she honored accordingly. He wanted the ranch to grow, not for wealth exactly, but for the satisfaction of building something that would outlast him. He wanted to be a better neighbor to the people in the Calico Creek country, some of whom had been struggling. He wrote in a letter that arrived on a Tuesday in late February and that Charlotte read and then set down and then picked up and read again, a family. Not as an abstraction, but as a specific thing with specific people that he was beginning to have specific ideas about. She wrote back with the same care she brought to everything she wanted to say with full weight. She told him that she wanted the same things, and that she had been cautious about wanting them after Thomas because wanting and losing in quick succession was the kind of thing that could teach a person the wrong lessons if they were not watchful. But that she had been watchful, and she was fairly certain now that she was not making an error. In April, when the school year had a month remaining, Owen rode up to Guthrie on a Friday and arrived at the schoolhouse just as Charlotte was releasing her students for the afternoon. She came out to find him sitting on the low fence across the road, hat in hand, watching her students stream past him with the expressions of people who have been freed from something they only half-minded, and he was watching them with a look of evident amusement. And then he saw Charlotte, and the amusement became something larger. "You didn't write that you were coming," she said, pleased in a way she did not try to conceal. "I wasn't sure I would until I was already on the road," he admitted. He stood up and came toward her. I have something I need to say, and I found I was tired of waiting to say it in a letter." They walked to the small park near the church, which was quiet in the Friday afternoon, and sat on one of the benches under the newly leafed cottonwood trees. And Owen Holloway, who was in most circumstances a man of economical words, took a breath and said, "Charlotte, I have been thinking about this since approximately January of last year, when I climbed off a stagecoach in Dry Creek and watched you look at me like you were trying to figure out if I had an angle, which I very much did not, and I would like your permission to court you properly, formally, with the intention of asking you to marry me when the time is right, which I will not rush. But I want you to know that is the direction I am heading, so that you can decide now if that is a road you want to be on." Charlotte looked at him for a moment. The cottonwood leaves made a pale green light around them, and the afternoon was warm and smelled of prairie grass and the faint sweetness of something blooming somewhere nearby. And Owen Holloway was looking at her with those steady dark eyes, and waiting with the patience of a man who is not certain of the answer but is not afraid of it either. "Owen," she said, "I have been on that road since February." The relief and the joy that went through his face was something she would remember for the rest of her life. He stayed in Guthrie through Sunday, and there was a new ease between them now that the intention had been named, the particular ease of people who have cleared the largest uncertainty from the room and can now simply be with each other. He sat in the back of Agnes Pruitt's parlor on Saturday evening, while Charlotte and Agnes and Franklin had supper, and he talked with Franklin about cattle prices and land surveys and the question of statehood for the territory, and Charlotte watched him across the table and thought, quietly and with great certainty, yes. Agnes caught her looking and said nothing, but smiled into her coffee cup in a way that said a great deal. He rode back south on Monday morning, and there was something new in the farewell this time, a confidence, a forward-facing quality, as though they were both finally pointed in the same direction. The month between April and the end of the school year passed in a state that Charlotte could only describe as pleasantly suspended animation. She taught her students with her full attention and counted the days to the summer, when she had arranged to spend 2 weeks at the Holloway Ranch. Agnes had raised a single practical eyebrow about the propriety of this, and Charlotte had said that she was 29 years old and a widow and she was going, and Agnes had immediately said she thought it was a fine idea. She arrived at the Holloway Ranch on a Wednesday morning in early June 1880, traveling by hired buggy from Calico Creek, which was the nearest town with a stage stop, 7 miles north of the ranch. The country around Calico Creek was different from Guthrie, lusher in some ways, more folded, with shallow hills and stands of blackjack oak and the glitter of the creek itself running through the bottom land. The Fork Road Junction was exactly where Owen's letters had said, a meeting of 2 dirt roads with a leaning signpost that pointed south toward the Holloway land, and she felt a small specific happiness at recognizing it from description. The ranch itself came into view gradually, the way things do in country that has room to reveal itself at its own pace. First the smoke from the chimney, then the roof of the main house, then the outbuildings, the barn and the bunkhouse and the smaller shed, and then the whole of it, a working operation that looked like exactly what it was, a place where someone had been building steadily and without show for a long time. The house was not large, but it was solid, built from good lumber and chinked against the weather, with a porch that ran along the front and held 2 chairs and a view of the creek draw that was, in the morning light, very close to magnificent. Owen was at the corral fence when the buggy came up the road, and he came forward to meet her with the particular walk of a man on his own ground, easy and unhurried. He helped her down from the buggy and held her hand a moment after she was down, and they looked at each other in the June morning with the pleasure of people who have been corresponding for the better part of a year and are standing in each other's actual company again. "You said it was good land," she said, looking around at the creek draw and the hills and the wide sky. "I believe I said exactly that," he agreed. He gave her a proper tour, which took most of the morning and involved his talking about the land with a depth of knowledge and affection that she found moving in its specificity. He knew every feature of the 340 acres, which way the water ran in a heavy rain, where the best grass was in late summer when other pastures were going dry, which stretches of fence needed replacing and which were sound. He talked about what he planned to add, another section to the south if the Tarkington family ever decided to sell, a better water system for the stock, eventually a proper bunkhouse that could hold more than 2 men if the herd grew to where he needed the help. He had hired a woman from Calico Creek, named Mrs. Eugenia Foss, to stay at the ranch for the 2 weeks of Charlotte's visit, a widow of excellent reputation who slept in the smaller bedroom, and whose presence satisfied the requirements of propriety without in any way diminishing the remarkable ease that Charlotte felt in that house. The kitchen was large and functional and smelled of wood smoke and coffee, and the main room had a good fireplace and more books than she had expected, tucked onto a simple shelf above the window, and she ran her finger along the spines and found well-worn copies of things she loved herself, and felt something click into place in a way that was not at all quiet. The days fell into a rhythm that was deeply pleasant, mornings of ranch work while Charlotte helped where she could and watched where she could not, afternoons of conversation on the porch or long walks along the creek, evenings of supper, and the kind of talk that does not need to accomplish anything. That is simply the pleasure of 2 people thinking out loud in each other's company. On the 4th evening, sitting on the porch in the blue summer dark with the fireflies beginning their small commerce in the creek draw below, Owen said, "What do you think of it, honestly?" "I think," Charlotte said carefully, because she wanted to say it right, "that I understand now why you love it. I can feel the shape of your life in this place. It's very specifically yours." "That's a good answer," he said quietly. "It is also," she said, "a place I could love." The silence that followed was the kind that held something very large very gently. "Charlotte," Owen said and stopped. He turned to face her. "I know I said I wouldn't rush, and I mean that. I don't want you to feel pressed. But I find that I cannot sit on this porch and not say what I have been thinking since you got here." He paused. "I would like you to come here, not to visit, to stay." She looked at him steadily. "Are you asking me to marry you, Owen Holloway?" "I am trying to," he said, with a self-awareness that made her love him quite acutely. "I am not doing it very gracefully." "You are doing it exactly right," she said. He leaned forward and took her hand in both of his, and he looked at her with all the seriousness and the warmth together, that combination that was uniquely his. "Will you marry me?" he said simply. "I will do everything in my power to make this place and this life something you are glad to have chosen. I promise you that." Charlotte felt the full weight of the moment, the evening and the fireflies and the sound of the creek below, and the particular man in front of her who had climbed off a stagecoach in a cloud of red dust to give his seat to a stranger, and then had left his name with the driver just in case she ever asked. She thought about the paper in her coat pocket and the 11 months it had taken her to find the courage to write, and the 14 months of letters, and the 4 January days and the April afternoon under the cottonwoods, and she understood that the whole long thread of it had been leading to exactly here, this porch, this question, this answer. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He let out a breath that told her he had not been entirely certain, which she found endearing, and then he raised her hand and pressed his lips to it in a gesture that was simple and old-fashioned and absolutely sincere. And then they sat together on the porch in the summer dark and talked about all of it, the when and the how and the what comes after, with the ease of people who have already done the harder work of knowing each other and are now simply arranging the details of a future they both want. They were married in September 1880 in the small church in Calico Creek, on a Saturday when the oaks were beginning to turn and the air had the first bite of autumn in it. The ceremony was attended by Agnes and Franklin Prout, who had made the journey from Guthrie with the cheerful inevitability of people who had been waiting for this particular event since January. Mrs. Eugenia Foss attended, and wept in the completely undisguised way of a woman who finds weeping at weddings not only acceptable but obligatory. Several of Owen's neighbors from the Creek country came, ranching families he had known for years. The Hendersons and the Tarkingtons and the Bauer family who had a place along the east fork of the creek, good people who brought food and goodwill in equal measure. Charlotte wore a dress she had made herself from blue wool, which Agnes had declared entirely acceptable, and which Owen had declared, with the direct simplicity that she had loved in him from the start, beautiful. They stood before the minister and said the words with the particular seriousness of people who have thought carefully about what words mean and intend to keep them. And when the minister finished, and they turned to face the small congregation, Charlotte was aware of a happiness that was not the giddy kind, not the kind that is made of nerves and excitement and the not knowing, but the deeper and more durable kind, the happiness of arrival, of a thing completed that was always supposed to happen. The celebration afterward in the churchyard lasted until the stars came out, and the October chill made the older guests seek their coats. And there was music from a fiddle played by a young man named Jasper Tarkington, who turned out to be considerably better at it than his age would have suggested. And there was food enough for twice the number of people present. And Franklin Prout gave a toast that was both longer and more sentimental than the occasion strictly required. And Agnes openly directed him to wrap it up, which he did with good humor. Charlotte and Owen drove home to the ranch in the dark, the roan and another horse pulling the light wagon through the October night, with the stars very bright and the air very cold and the land very quiet. And she sat close beside him on the wagon seat, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they were almost entirely silent for the 7 miles. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everything had been said, and the silence now was full of contentment rather than emptiness. And she thought about the Dry Creek station and the crowded stagecoach and Pete Greer's crooked nose, and the paper she had kept for 11 months, and she thought that the journey from there to here, from a stranger giving up a seat in a cloud of red dust to this wagon seat under these stars, was the most important journey she had ever made. The life they built at the Holloway Ranch was not without its difficulties, because nothing real is, but the difficulties were the kind that could be worked through together, and they worked through them together, which made all the difference. The first full year of marriage brought the particular pleasure of learning another person from the inside rather than the outside, discovering not only all the things the letters had conveyed truly, but all the things they had not fully been able to convey. Charlotte discovered that Owen was an early riser by nature, that he was reliably up before sunrise every morning regardless of season, and that he moved through the early dark of the house with a quiet efficiency that she found oddly soothing, the sounds of coffee being made, and the back door opening and closing as he went out to check on the horses, the sounds of a man who is genuinely comfortable in his own life. She discovered that he had a habit of reading before sleep that was deeply companionable to her own, and that his taste in books ran to history and to the practical, with occasional raids into fiction that surprised and pleased her. She discovered that he was quicker to laughter than his exterior suggested, and that his humor ran dry and unexpected, appearing at the moments you least anticipated it, which kept her perpetually a little delighted. Owen discovered that Charlotte was the most organized person he had ever shared a house with, that she brought to the management of the ranch household the same systematic mind she brought to the schoolhouse, and that this organization produced results he had not previously experienced in the running of his domestic life. A kitchen that made actual sense, supplies that were replenished before they ran out, the particular pleasure of a house that felt ordered and inhabited rather than simply occupied. He discovered that she was more stubborn than her gentle manner advertised, in the best possible way, that once she had formed a view about something she would hold it against considerable pressure, and was almost always right. He discovered that she had a vivid imagination that enlivened her conversation in ways that continually surprised him. He discovered that she cried at books, sometimes at passages he would not have predicted would produce the reaction, and that this did not embarrass her, and that he found it touching rather than perplexing. In the late spring of 1881, Charlotte told him she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen on a May morning while the window was open and the sound of the creek was coming up the slope, because she had thought about various settings for the telling and had decided she would simply tell him when the moment felt right rather than constructing a scene, and the moment had felt right, and so she told him. Owen set down his coffee cup and looked at her. "Are you sure?" he said. "I am quite sure," she said. He came around the table and put both hands on her face and looked at her with an expression that was beyond what she could have described, joy and gravity and tenderness, and something that was in the vicinity of awe all at once, and he kissed her forehead and then just held her for a moment, and she put her arms around him and felt his heart beating very fast under her hands. "We are going to have a family," he said, very quietly, as though saying it aloud was a thing that required care. "We are," she confirmed. Their son was born in December of 1881, on a cold night when the wind was coming from the north and the fire in the hearth was burning well. Mrs. Foss came to help, as did the Calico Creek doctor, a competent and unhurried man named Aldrich who had delivered several hundred babies in the territory and treated the occasion with the warm professionalism of long practice. Owen spent the hours of the labor in that particular purgatory that husbands of the era occupied, close enough to be present but managed to the edges of things, and when Dr. Aldrich came to the door of the bedroom and said, "Mr. Holloway, you have a son," Owen went to the doorway and saw Charlotte propped against the pillows with a small wrapped person in her arms and a look of exhausted radiance on her face, and he crossed the room and sat beside her and looked at the baby, who was red-faced and dark-haired and appeared to have opinions about the situation. And Owen put one finger against the baby's small fist, and the fist closed around it with a grip that was absurdly strong for something so new, and he was undone completely. They named the boy Daniel Thomas Holloway, the Daniel for Owen's father and the Thomas for Charlotte's late husband, because she had wanted to carry that name forward and Owen had agreed immediately, which she had loved him for in a way that was sharp and specific, and that she kept privately in the warmest part of herself. Daniel Thomas was a vigorous and opinionated baby who grew into a vigorous and opinionated small boy with his father's dark eyes and his mother's quick mind. And the ranch changed around him, not physically, but in the way a place changes when it is being grown up in, acquiring a child-shaped significance in its corners and its creek banks and its fences and its outbuildings. Owen hired 2 hands in the spring of 1882, brothers named Hector and Louis, raised from south of the territory border, hard-working and reliable men who had come north following the cattle work. Owen paid them fairly and treated them with the same straight-dealing respect he gave everyone, which was not universally common among ranchers of the period, and they were loyal to the Holloway operation in consequence. The herd grew, and the ranch grew with it, and Owen began quiet negotiations with old Silas Tarkington about that south section he had mentioned to Charlotte in their first week at the ranch together. Charlotte had arranged with the Calico Creek School Board to continue teaching on a reduced schedule, 2 days a week, which allowed her to do the work she loved without abandoning the home she loved, and the compromise suited her very well. She drove the 7 miles to Calico Creek and back on her teaching days in the buggy, through country she had come to know as intimately as a book she had read many times, and the familiarity was not dullness but comfort, the pleasure of knowing where you are. The Calico Creek country was changing in the early 1880s, as the territory changed around it, more settlers arriving, more fencing going up, the questions of land and water rights becoming more contentious as the population increased and the space became more contested. Owen navigated these changes with his characteristic directness, talking honestly with his neighbors about shared interests and genuine conflicts, advocating at the county level for the fair treatment of the small ranchers and farmers who were increasingly pressured by the larger cattle concerns that were moving into the region. He was also, in this period, part of a community conversation about the treatment of the Muskogee people who had historical claims to portions of the territory land, claims that the federal government was in the process of systematically diminishing. Owen was not a man who made political speeches, but he was a man who said what he thought plainly when asked. And what he thought was that the taking of land from people who had already had it taken from them multiple times, who had been marched across a continent to this place specifically, and were now having this place renegotiated out from under them as well, was an injustice that the prosperity of people like himself could not be cleanly separated from. He said this at county meetings and over supper tables and in private conversation, and it made some of his neighbors uncomfortable, which was not his concern. Charlotte loved him for this without qualification. In the summer of 1883, they lost a pregnancy at 4 months, which was a grief that they carried quietly and together. Charlotte grieved with a depth that was private, and Owen was with her in it in the way he was with her in most things, not by trying to fix what could not be fixed, but by simply being present in a full and undiminished way. They did not talk about it constantly, but they did not avoid it either, and they were tender with each other through the long, late summer months in a way that deepened something between them that was already deep. By the autumn of 1883, Charlotte was expecting again, and this time the pregnancy continued to its full term, and in April of 1884, in the same bedroom where Daniel Thomas had come into the world, they welcomed a second child. It was a girl. They named her Louise Agnes, the Agnes for the woman in the Guthrie dry goods store who had mentioned the Holloway Ranch on a September afternoon in 1879, as though it were entirely ordinary conversation, and who had therefore, in Charlotte's private accounting, changed the course of everything. Agnes Prout received this information by letter and wrote back immediately in a hand that was somewhat less steady than usual, and which contained 2 crossing-out corrections, which for Agnes, who wrote a perfect letter as a matter of principle, was the equivalent of open weeping. Louise Agnes turned out to be a person of considerable force and charm, fair-haired where her brother was dark, loud where Daniel Thomas had been thoughtful, interested in everything simultaneously, and willing to apply herself to nothing long enough to fully master it, which caused her parents varying degrees of amusement and exasperation in proportions that shifted by the day. Daniel Thomas, at 2½, regarded his new sister with the watchful caution of a person who is not entirely sure a thing is going to work out, but is willing to observe the evidence for a while. The ranch was doing well by 1884. The herd was healthy, and the market prices were favorable, and Owen had finally completed the purchase of the south section from Silas Tarkington, who had decided to retire to a house in town now that his own children had scattered. The additional land gave the Holloway operation a water access point that Owen had been wanting for years, a reliable spring that ran all year regardless of rainfall, and with it came the ability to expand the herd with confidence. He hired a third hand, a young man from the Cherokee Nation named Eli Standing Bear, who was quiet and extraordinarily skilled with horses, better than anyone Owen had seen, and who became, over the months of working together, a person whose opinion on ranch matters Owen respected as much as his own. Charlotte liked Eli Standing Bear immediately, and with the uncomplicated directness of a person who reads people accurately. She invited him to supper with the family on Sunday evenings when the week's work was done, a practice that Owen endorsed without discussion. Eli was, she thought, a person carrying the particular weight of someone who has had to prove their worth in a world that has decided it in advance, and she treated him with the consistent, straightforward respect that she believed was simply owed to a person, no more and no less. He was 22 years old and extraordinarily self-contained, and he made an excellent pot of coffee, which he always contributed to Sunday suppers as though it were a calling card. The years settled into themselves in the way good years do, not in the sense of being undramatic. There was a grass fire in the summer of 1885 that burned 40 acres before it was stopped and required 3 days of exhausting work from every hand in Owen and 2 of the Henderson boys from the neighboring place. And there was a bad winter in 1886 that froze the creek for 6 weeks and tested the reserve feed supplies that Owen had laid in more carefully than ever before. And there was an outbreak of fever in Calico Creek in the spring of 1887 that kept Charlotte anxious about the children for the better part of 2 months, though both Daniel and Louise came through it without being touched. But these were the textures of a real life rather than catastrophes, and they moved through all of them with the basic soundness of people who are adequately supplied with the things that matter, love and work and loyalty, and the willingness to face the hard days without losing sight of what they were working toward. Owen turned 38 in 1885, and Charlotte organized a supper that she planned to be simple, and that Agnes Prout, who had come down from Guthrie for it specifically, conspired to make considerably less simple. The table in the main room was crowded with people, the Rays brothers and Eli standing bare, and the Henderson family and Mrs. Eugenia Foss and the Bowers and Agnes and Franklin Prout, and Owen sat at the head of it with Daniel Thomas on one side and Louise on the other, and Charlotte at the far end where she could see his face. And he looked around the table at these people in a way that was entirely unguarded, the look of a man who is genuinely, foundationally happy. And he caught Charlotte's eye across the table and held it for a moment, and she felt the same thing she had felt on the porch in the June dark 5 years earlier. The click of something fitting perfectly into the space it was made for. After the children were in bed and the guests had gone, they sat on the porch together in the October night, which was their habit in all weathers that permitted it, and Owen said, "I did not expect this." "Which part?" Charlotte asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark that held the creek and the hills and the 340 acres. "Any of it," he said. "I expected the ranch. I expected the cattle and the work. I expected to be alone for a long time and then probably less alone eventually in some general sense. I did not expect," he said and paused, "this specifically, you specifically, the children, the way it has turned out. Is that a good thing?" Charlotte said, though she knew the answer. "Charlotte," he said, with the patience of a man who has stopped being surprised by her occasional need for something that she already knows to be confirmed aloud, "it is the best possible thing." She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the comfortable dark for a long time. The school in Calico Creek grew in the late 1880s as the territory's population grew, and Charlotte eventually shifted from 2 days a week to 3. And the school board, recognizing a teacher who was genuinely exceptional in the way that genuine exceptionalism is recognizable regardless of whether it is formally acknowledged, asked her in the spring of 1888 if she would consider taking on the role of lead teacher, as a second teacher was being hired. She discussed it with Owen, who said she should do exactly what she wanted to do, which was the correct answer, and she took the position. The new second teacher was a young woman named Harriet Vance, 23 years old, fresh from a teaching school in Kansas, who arrived in Calico Creek in September 1888 with a trunk full of books and the bright, nervous energy of a person starting the life they had been preparing for. Charlotte liked her immediately and made her feel welcome in the way that Charlotte made most people feel welcome, with an unceremonious warmth that was neither performance nor effort but simply how she was. Harriet Vance and Eli Standing Bear met in October 1888 at one of the Holloway Sunday suppers, which had by that point become a modest institution that various people of the Calico Creek community wandered in and out of over the years. The meeting was, on the surface, unremarkable, a polite exchange of introductions and the careful conversation of strangers. Charlotte observed it from the kitchen doorway with the particular alertness of a woman who has learned to notice the moments when two people's attention locates itself in each other without either of them quite intending it. She said nothing to Owen about it that evening, but he noticed it too because he noticed most things, and when they were alone he said quietly, "Interesting supper," and Charlotte said, "Very," and that was that. Eli and Harriet navigated their own story through the remainder of that year and the next, carefully, and with the particular difficulty of two people who are both self-possessed and uncertain in equal measure, and who also faced the reality that their connection was not universally celebrated in the Calico Creek community, where a Cherokee man and a white woman making their intentions clear to each other was a thing that some people had specific and ugly opinions about. Owen and Charlotte were not among those people, and the Holloway Ranch and Table remained a place where Eli and Harriet were equally and uncomplicatedly welcome, which was a thing that both of them understood and were grateful for. They were married in the spring of 1890, a small ceremony at the ranch itself since Eli did not feel entirely at ease in the Calico Creek church, and Charlotte and Owen were the witnesses, and Daniel Thomas, who was 8 years old and had decided that Eli was the most impressive person he had ever encountered primarily on the basis of the horsemanship, stood in the yard with Louise and watched with the seriousness of a child who understands that something important is happening. The 1890s brought more change to the territory, the land run of 1889 having accelerated the transformation of the region with a speed that was, to the people already settled there, somewhat dizzying. The Oklahoma Territory was filling up and finding its edges, and the questions of statehood, of land rights, of who belonged and who was still being pushed toward nothing, were increasingly urgent. Owen continued to say what he thought at county meetings and township gatherings, and Charlotte wrote letters to the territorial newspapers under her name, without the softening that women's opinions were often expected to carry. Some of what she wrote was about education, the conditions of rural schooling, the need for more and better supported teachers. Some of it was about the treatment of the native nations in the territory, the systematic compression of their land, the particular cruelty of an ongoing process that had been named settled policy, but was in practice simply an extended dispossession. She wrote clearly and without apology, because she had learned from Owen that the clearest way to say a thing is usually the right way. Daniel Thomas grew up on the ranch with the easy competence of a boy raised around real work, learning to ride and to work cattle with the patience his father brought to all teaching, learning from books with the appetite his mother had always trusted he would develop. By the time he was 12, he was genuinely useful on the ranch in a way that was not the performed usefulness of a child given simple tasks, but the actual usefulness of a young person learning a trade. By 15, he had opinions about cattle that Hector Reyes, who was as seasoned a hand as the Holloway Ranch had ever employed, found worth listening to. Louise Agnes grew in a different direction, which was exactly right, since direction choosing appeared to be her primary personality trait. She was sharp and social, and interested in everything that her brother was not and several things that he was also, and she wanted to talk about all of it all the time with everyone available, and she was funny in the way that people who observe other people closely and quickly tend to be funny, catching the precise absurdity of a thing and naming it at the exact right moment. Charlotte recognized in her the particular quality of a person who will do well in the world on the strength of their ability to understand it, and she cultivated this in Louise with quiet attention. The summer of 1892 brought Owen's brother Cal back from the East, which was not something anyone had expected, including Owen. Cal Holloway arrived on a Tuesday morning in July without any forewarning, riding a horse that looked as though it had been hired in Guthrie and abused by the humidity. And he was both the same person Owen remembered and considerably different, 12 years of Boston and Philadelphia, and whatever else he had been doing having put a visible layer of somewhere else over the person underneath. He was 31 to Owen's 45, and he looked at Charlotte with the frank admiration of a man who has not seen his brother's life up close before and has just understood what he has been missing. "I like her very much," Cal told Owen privately, approximately 1 day into his visit. "I should hope so," Owen said. "She is remarkable." "You always were impossible to compete with," Cal said, which was apparently a thing from their childhood, and which made Owen laugh in a way Charlotte recognized as belonging specifically to the old world of brothers, a language within a language. Cal stayed for 6 weeks, ostensibly to help with the midsummer ranch work, actually to locate himself in relation to a life he had moved away from and was tentatively considering moving back toward. He was good company, funnier than Owen in the louder way, and not as funny in the quiet way, interested in the territory and its changes with the particular curiosity of a person who has been away from a place long enough to see it with partial fresh eyes. He was good with Daniel Thomas, who found his uncle's Eastern stories fascinating, and good with Louise, who found his Eastern stories less fascinating than his willingness to listen to her at length, which was always her primary standard for evaluating a person. Cal went back east in September with the stated intention of finishing what he had started there and returning to the territory within 2 years. This is exactly what he did, arriving back in the Calico Creek country in the autumn of 1894 and buying a small parcel of land 12 miles north of the Holloway Ranch, where he proposed to do something that Owen privately thought was not quite practical enough to be described as ranching, but which Cal called diversified farming, and which appeared to involve a great deal of enthusiastic experimentation. They saw him regularly, and Charlotte appreciated having Owen's brother in the world and in proximity, another warm body in the constellation of their life. The year 1895 was the year that Charlotte's former student, a boy named Amos Garfield, who had attended the Calico Creek school from the age of 7 until the age of 14, and who had been the kind of student who is exactly brilliant enough to get into considerable trouble, came back to Calico Creek as a newly elected member of the territorial legislature. He was 23 years old and very pleased with himself, and had not changed in any essential respect since the age of 12, which Charlotte told him over the parlor table at the ranch while he ate 3 pieces of pie and laughed at himself with the genuine self-knowledge that had always been his best quality. Owen shook his hand and told him to do good work, which Charlotte suspected was the most direct advice he would receive from anyone in his new position. In 1896, Daniel Thomas was 14 years old and Louise Agnes was 12, and the Holloway Ranch was running 420 head of cattle on its expanded acreage, with 3 full-time hands and 1 part-time, and Owen Holloway was, by the estimate of his neighbors and his banker and his own calm self-assessment, a successful rancher in the full sense of the word. He had not become wealthy in the scale that the large cattle combines measured things, but he had built something real and lasting and paid for honestly, and he slept without the specific bad sleep of a man who owes more than he can manage. Charlotte, at 45, was still teaching, still writing for the papers, still the person in the Calico Creek country that people went to when they needed someone to write something important for them, or to read something complicated, or simply to think through a problem out loud with someone who would tell them what they needed to hear rather than what they wanted to. She was the same person she had been at 28, only more so, which is what the best years tend to do to a person, not alter them but amplify the truest version of themselves. One evening in November of 1897, Owen came in from the barn and found her in the main room reading by lamplight, and he stood in the doorway for a moment just looking at her, still in his coat, and she looked up and said, "What is it?" "Nothing," he said. "I was just thinking about Pete Greer." She set down her book. "You were thinking about Pete Greer, the stagecoach driver from Dry Creek Station." "I know who Pete Greer is," Charlotte said. "I am curious about the mental path that took you there on a November evening after checking the horses." Owen came in and sat in the chair across from her and pulled off his coat. "I was thinking about that note," he said. "That piece of paper. I have thought about it many times over the years, whether it was a reckless thing to do, whether you would think it was forward or strange." "I thought it was brave," she said immediately. "I always thought that. A man who does not know if a woman will ever ask, who writes down his name and his address anyway, and gives it to a stagecoach driver on the chance that she might want to know. That takes a particular quality of hope." Owen was quiet for a moment. The fire in the hearth was going well and the house was warm, and from somewhere in the back of the house there was the sound of Daniel Thomas practicing his letters for a school assignment, a quiet industry. "I was not certain it was hope," Owen said. "It may have been something closer to stubbornness. I had been thinking about you for the whole day of travel after Dry Creek, and I was not ready for that to simply stop when I reached wherever I was going." "What were you thinking?" she asked, because she had never asked him this specifically. He considered it. "I was thinking that you were the most awake person I had seen in a long time," he said. "The way you looked at me to check if there was an angle. Most people do not look that carefully. I liked it. You liked that I was suspicious of you. I liked that you were paying attention," he said. "And I liked that you said thank you when you didn't have to. After you'd satisfied yourself I wasn't running an angle. Just a plain thank you, like you meant it." He looked at the fire. "I thought if she ever asks Pete about that note, and if she is willing to correspond, and if she is half what she seemed in those 4 minutes at Dry Creek, this could be the beginning of something very specific and very good." He paused. "I was correct." Charlotte felt something warm and certain settle through her from the center out. "You were extraordinarily correct," she said. 19 years next autumn," he said, and there was a satisfaction in it that was not complacency but completion, the feeling of a distance well traveled. "September 20th, 1880, she said, because she always remembered dates the way he always remembered landmarks. "Will you remember where you want to go for our 20th?" he said. "I want to go to Dry Creek," she said, which surprised her even as she said it, the clarity of the desire. "I want to see if that station is still there." "I expect Pete Greer is long retired," Owen said. "I don't need Pete Greer. I just want to see the place," she said. "Where it started. I find I would like to stand there again with you and look at it." Owen looked at her across the fire, with the dark eyes that had been the same since the day she had turned and found him unfolding himself from the stagecoach door, and he smiled the smile that she had known for 19 years and that still rearranged things. "Then that is where we will go," he said. The following years rolled forward with the particular momentum of a life that has found its direction and is simply living in it. Daniel Thomas grew into a man who was very like his father in the important ways and had his mother's articulate mind besides. And by the time he was 20, he was working the Holloway Ranch with a full-hand skill and a foreman's intelligence. He was a quiet young man with a dry humor that appeared at unexpected moments, and he had his grandfather's name and carried it without the weight that some people attach to the names of the dead. Louise Agnes, at 16, was the most determinedly talkative person in 3 counties and had developed, alongside this, a genuine gift for understanding what people needed from a conversation, which was a rarer combination than it might seem. She had her mother's green eyes and her father's steadiness underneath the social energy, and she was going to be, Charlotte thought with a private contentment, whoever she decided to be, which she had not yet fully decided. In the spring of 1898, Eli Standing Bear and Harriet Vance Holloway, who had been quietly building their own life in the Calico Creek country for 8 years, welcomed their second child, a boy they named Owen James, the Owen being their specific and straightforward acknowledgement of the man at whose table they had met, and who had been, without ceremony or agenda, a steady good in their lives. Owen Holloway received this information from Eli in the barn one morning and was unable to speak for a full 30 seconds, which was longer than Charlotte had ever observed him unable to speak, and which told her, when he came into the kitchen with his face doing several things at once, everything she needed to know before he said a word. "They named the boy Owen," he said. Charlotte set down her coffee cup and looked at him. "Of course they did," she said in the tone of a woman who is entirely unsurprised. "Sit down, Owen." He sat down. She put her hand over his on the table. Outside the window, the May morning was opening up, the light going gold across the creek draw, the cattle beginning to move in the far pasture, the ranch busy with itself in the easy way of a place that knows what it is. "We have had a very good life," Owen said, not as a summary but as a statement of present tense, as though the observation was just occurring to him with full force. "We have," Charlotte agreed, "and we are going to keep having it." He looked at her. "How long do you intend for us to keep having it?" "Owen Holloway," she said, with the patience and the warmth of a woman who has been married to a man long enough to know when he is being deliberate about being sentimental, "indefinitely." He laughed, and she laughed, and the May morning continued outside the window, and the ranch went about its business around them. Their 20th anniversary came in September 1900, and they went a dry creek, as Charlotte had said they would. The station was still there, weathered and smaller than either of them, remembered in the way that the places of important moments always seem to diminish in their physical scale, while growing in their interior significance. The Butterfield line no longer ran the same route, the railways having rerouted the major commerce of the territory, and the station saw light traffic rather than the busy way station business of 1878. But it was standing, and the hitching posts were still there, and the long bench along the exterior wall where Charlotte had sat with her hatbox for 3 hours was still there. They stood in front of it in the September morning, Owen and Charlotte Holloway, both of them considerably further into their lives than they had been the first time they had stood here. And Charlotte looked at the bench and the door and the red Oklahoma dust that was still the same red Oklahoma dust, unchanged by any of the decades between, and felt the completeness of it very fully. "This is where you gave me your seat," she said. "This is where you looked at me like I might be running an angle," he said. "This is where Pete Greer had the note in his pocket," she said. "This is where it started," Owen said simply. Charlotte turned to look at him, this man who had climbed off a stagecoach 22 years ago, and left his name and address with the driver in case a certain woman asked, and she thought about everything the years between had held. The letters and the January visit and the April afternoon under the cottonwoods and the porch in the June dark, and the September wedding and Daniel Thomas and Louise Agnes, and the grass fire, and the bad winter and Eli and Harriet and Cal coming back, and Amos Garfield with his 3 pieces of pie, and the baby named Owen James in the Standing Bear household, and all the Sunday suppers, and all the October porches, and every evening and every morning of 20 years. Of a life that was specifically and irreplaceably theirs. It was a good place to start, she said. He put his hand on her face the way he had done the May morning she had told him she was expecting Daniel Thomas, with both hands and the full gentle weight of his attention, and he looked at her with the dark, steady eyes that were the same as they had ever been, and he said, "You are still the most awake person I have ever seen." She covered his hands with hers. "And you still have no angle," she said. He kissed her there in front of the old Dry Creek station in the September morning, while the red Oklahoma dust lifted off the road in the light breeze and drifted past them, unhurried, going wherever the wind was taking it, which was somewhere west, somewhere forward, somewhere into the wide and continuing country. On the drive back to the ranch, they talked about Daniel Thomas, who had told them at supper last week that there was a young woman in Calico Creek he had been thinking about, the daughter of the Bauer family, a serious and clever girl named Ruth, who Charlotte had always found exceptional. Owen had listened to this information and said, "Tell me about her," and Daniel Thomas had told him, and Owen had nodded and said, "You should make your intentions clear, and do it honestly so she knows what she's deciding." And Charlotte had caught Owen's eye across the table with the specific warmth of a woman who recognizes advice that comes directly from experience. They talked about Louise Agnes, who had announced her desire to attend the women's college in Kansas that had been operating for the past decade, and that Charlotte had been quietly corresponding with for the past year, just gathering information against the possibility. Louise Agnes had formed this intention with the totality of commitment that characterized every position she had ever taken, and she had presented it to her parents with an organized argument that Charlotte had found privately impressive and Owen had found privately amusing, and they had both found it entirely persuasive, because it was. They talked about the ranch and the cattle and the south pasture fence that needed attention before winter, and they talked about Agnes Prout, who had written last month to say that she and Franklin were thinking about visiting in the spring for a proper stay, rather than the day trips that had become their usual pattern as they got older. And Owen had said immediately that the spare bedroom would be ready whenever they were, and Charlotte had written back to say the same with added detail. They talked about Eli and Harriet and their two boys, Owen James and the older one, Peter, who was named for no one's driver but for Harriet's late father, and who had, against all logical expectation for a 4-year-old, already identified horses as his principal interest in life, which suggested he had been paying close attention to his father's work. The road back to the ranch was the same road it had always been, red and dusty, and lined with the oak and the sage and the silver-flashing creek in the bottom land, and the September afternoon light came across it at the particular angle that Charlotte thought of as October approaching, a gentler light, a longer shadow, the air beginning to carry the first tentative message of the season turning. Owen drove the buggy with the ease of a man who has driven this road several thousand times and trusts every mile of it, and Charlotte sat beside him as she had always sat beside him on this road, close enough that their arms were touching, watching the familiar country go past with the pleasure of a person who has arrived somewhere and intends to stay. The ranch came into view, the smoke from the chimney, the roof, the barn and the bunkhouse, and Daniel Thomas was visible at the corral, and he raised a hand when he saw them coming, and Owen raised his own hand back, the particular economical wave of a father and a son who speak the same practical language. They were home. There would be more years. Charlotte had no doubt of this, not in the foolish sense of assuming invincibility, but in the sober sense of a woman who has looked at the life she has built and found it sound. There would be Ruth Bower at the supper table more often and then always, and eventually at the Calico Creek church on a good day, and eventually a grandchild or two or several, appearing in the way of grandchildren, suddenly and urgently. There would be Louise Agnes coming back from Kansas, with a mind sharpened on everything she had learned there, and new opinions about things that would require the good, long table discussions she had always generated. There would be Cal's farm continuing its enthusiastic experimental existence 12 miles north, and Cal himself continuing his cheerful commentary on the gap between his farming intentions and his farming results. There would be more Sunday suppers and more October porches, and more evenings with the lamp lit, and the fire going, and the particular sound of the house settling into its nightly rhythms. There would be all of that, and there would be this, always this, the two of them on the seat of the buggy coming home on the September road, 20 years behind them, and whatever good years the world intended still ahead. Owen guided the horses in through the gate and Daniel Thomas came forward to take the reins, and Charlotte stepped down from the buggy with Owen's hand on hers, and they stood for a moment in the yard of the Holloway Ranch in the September afternoon, and she looked at him once more with the same green eyes that had been checking for angles since the Dry Creek station in the autumn of 1878, and found, as she had been finding for 20 years, that there were none. Only the man. Only the life. Only all of it exactly as it was. Home, she said. Home, he agreed, and they went in.